Hi, this is Paul. I was working on the kinds of things I'm always working on, and this new Peterson video came up. I didn't know who David Buss was. Evolution of Desire. That was a little bit interesting, and I thought, well, I'll give it a little bit of a listen. And almost right away, very interesting video, very interesting conversation. So let's dive in, and we'll see if I can sort of hook it up and triangulate it with some other things that I've been thinking about lately.
The causal processes that created human nature, whatever that nature may be.
Now, right away, nature. Now, for those of you who are already upset that I've interrupted him, just go to Jordan B. Peterson's YouTube channel and you can listen to the whole conversation without me. Okay? The whole thing is there. It's I'm just doing my little interrupting thing here on my channel. So if you want to hear this without me, just go to Jordan B. Peterson, almost 5 million subscribers, big channel, lots of views. You can find it all there. This channel, I interrupt. So those of you who saw my Sunday school class this week know that I'm going to be spending 2 or 3 weeks on the question of nature and what we mean by that word and human nature. Now, I could do 2 hours just on this question because if you've been following the Jordan Peterson conversation for the last 4 years, there's a big question about, well, is there a human nature? What on earth do we mean by that? Is there sort of a definable reality that is across cultures that has been impacted and stabilized through time that we can productively talk about and sort of manage in our mental imaginary? Now, I want to get into this question of an imaginary. I've been reading Carl Trueman's book. Now, a number of you had recommended this to me. I bought the Kindle version a number of months ago. I had started reading it, and as is typical for me, too many books, I get distracted, this and that. And the audio version just came out. I also noted that Dave Beelan, a mentor of mine, had recommended it in his book, in his video. So I thought, oh, I'll give Trueman's work a listen, and I've been enjoying it. There's a lot in there, and I want to treat it and see if at all possible I can bring it into this conversation as well. So this whole question of human nature is, again, it's one of these things that we just say human nature and it just bang, put it out there. In terms of my young education in conservative, Dutch Reformed, day school, human nature is just a part of that. Human nature is a big part of sort of a negative valence of human nature is a big part of Augustinian theological tradition. So,
Yeah, well, even
And
the more biologically oriented psychologists, the behaviorists, for example, like Skinner, the people who studied rats and who did that so carefully, because that's a great tradition and it really led to the emergence of neuroscience. There was not a lot of evolutionary thinking there, because underlying that behaviorist ethos was the idea that human beings were something like a blank slate and that almost everything we did was learned.
yes, indeed. And Skinner,
and when he says almost everything was learned, he means learned by the individual. Everything we were sort of born into the world and whoop, out we go, and then we just kind of learn, pick stuff up. And this is where we're going to continue to work through the conversation about egregores. What are ideas? Are ideas sort of this static image, sort of like a Word document, or is there something else that's working among us intergenerationally? Now, this intergenerational thing is very important, because part of what at least Darwinian thinking opens us up to is the idea of intergenerational processes, if I'm going to speak Canadian, and we're going to have to wrestle with the idea of agency intergenerationally. So
believe he actually overlapped a bit with him at Harvard. So I was able to actually have a couple conversations with him. And he believed that what evolution had created was simply a couple of domain general learning mechanisms. Classical conditioning, operant conditioning were the ones that he focused on, and he built this whole theory about that. But essentially so you equip humans and rats or pigeons with this blank slate domain general learning mechanisms, and then all subsequent action is based on contingencies of reinforcement. So but I think even,
and again, this idea that all human beings sort of let's say the birth canal is the starting line and the grave is the finish line, and everything that happens is going to happen between those two lines. Not anymore.
Then, even when I was in graduate school, that view struck me as really problematic. For one thing, sex differences, emerge very early in life. Rough and tumble play by age 3 or so emerges consistently early in development. And
sense of humor.
Sense of humor. And these things are cross-culturally universal. So the notion that all of our nature consists just of the contingencies of reinforcement during our lifespan struck me as problematic. And so really that search for a solid scientific foundation for a theory of human nature is what led me to evolutionary theory. And then, of course, reading people like Trivers, Don Simons, George C. Williams, of course, W.D. Hamilton, some of the great evolutionary biologists of the last century, led me to the view that I could actually test some evolutionary hypotheses in humans. And at the time that I started, there were almost no empirical tests. And, if you know anything about the kind of Berkeley, Minnesota tradition, a lot of my mentors were Minnesota, there's a very strong empirical tradition. And so as a psychologist trained in an empirical tradition, you have to test these things. And what I realized is that there were almost no empirical tests of these evolutionary hypotheses. And so that's what led me to that. And some of the most obvious ones were mating. So as a sexually reproducing species, everything has to go through mating. And so if humans don't have pretty interesting and complex psychological adaptations for mating, then we're kind of out of business. So, survival and mating. But if you're a sexually reproducing species, you have to go through the bottleneck of mating, and that it's not a simple process. Of course, if you're asexual, you don't have to go searching for a mate. But
if you're asexual, you're not listening to this podcast.
Sexually reproducing species, you have to select a mate. You have to attract a mate. In our species, you have to be mutually selected by that mate. And then in our species, of course, we have long-term mating, pair bonded mating, which is extremely rare in the mammalian world. The male and king, we have something like 5,000 species plus of mammals, and only something like 3 to 5% have anything resembling pair bonded long-term mating. But humans do have it. It's part, and that's part of our nature. Now, as we get into,
and that's part of our nature. So human nature is sort of, you almost get the idea of this giant spreadsheet that has, elements and maybe variables on it, and this'll, these are ranked, these are weighted, so on and so forth. It's fascinating vision of human nature, a fascinating word choice too. And again, as my Sunday school class continues to work on Romans 1, we'll continue to talk about what on earth I mean by nature.
Mating strategies. One of the things that I argue is that long-term mating is not the only mating strategy within the human menu of mating strategies. And we have long-term pair bonded, but we also have short-term mating, casual sex hookups, as they're now called on college campuses. We have some infidelity rates. So that's kind of a mixed mating strategy, one long-term mate, some
It's such a romantic thing to say. Honey, I think I'd like to pursue a mixed mating strategy. promptly followed by a smack and a door slam.
Short-term sex partners on the side. And then we also do serial mating. And then if you look across cultures, we have...
Serial mating doesn't fare much better.
In Western cultures, a presumptively monogamous mating system, but some cultures have polygynous mating systems, one man, multiple wives, some restricted to 4, some don't have any restrictions. And then very, very rarely do you have a polyandrous mating system, less than 1%, where it's one woman, multiple men. So anyway.
And do you have any sense of what conditions give rise to that rare exception, that polyandrous system, since it's so uncommon? How is it that it sustains itself? And why isn't that a challenge to the notion of a central monogamy, let's say?
Yes. Well, the conditions under which it occurs are typically where one man cannot support a whole family. So if there's a large
Now this is where the conversation begins, and where we're going to talk about upper and lower registers here, where part of what is interesting about this is that there are environmental factors and there are going to be cultural, and we're going to think of cultural as upper register factors too.
And one man can't support a wife and children, then it will be 2 men. So the polyandrous mating is almost entirely brothers. And that genetic relatedness.
And that's a very interesting thing, again, because, I'm a minister, and so I've got a lot of experience with the Bible, and you have this tradition in Hebrew society that if a man dies, his brother has to continue the line. And that's sort of a serial approach to this. And of course, people in our culture are like, I gotta sleep with my sister-in-law. Now that might be an exciting prospect, or that might be a less exciting prospect. But there you have it. It's in the Bible.
This helps to ease what normally would be a pretty intense jealous reaction to someone else sharing a sex partner, someone else having sex with your wife. And
so why isn't it sufficient to say, like the sort of more modern blank slate theorists might, that patriarchy is a sufficient explanation for the difference in mating strategies across the sexes, and that the reason that polyandry is so uncommon is because women are dominated by men everywhere, and that's arbitrary and expression of power. It has nothing to do with our central biological tendency.
Okay, that's a really interesting question, and I have a couple of...
Let's dive in, my friend. Welcome to the culture war.
Different thoughts on it. First of all, the first question is like, what does one mean by patriarchy? And if you get into it, and I've asked people who invoke those sort of explanations, well, what do you mean by patriarchy? And usually that causes them to stumble and mumble around. Well, and they just know, well, patriarchy, as though it's self-explanatory. Well, it's not self-explanatory, because if you break it down analytically, you can identify different components. So is it the case that men worldwide tend to have more resources, more economic resources than women on average? Well, the answer is yes. But then even if you take that component of what's called patriarchy, you can ask the question, well, how did it come to pass that across all cultures, or nearly all cultures, men on average have more resources? Well, as one biological anthropologist, I think this was Irv DeVore at Harvard, he said men are one long breeding experiment run by women. Basically one of the things that one of my first studies, the 37 culture study, documented is that women have a universal preference for men with resources. And so that sets up a co-evolutionary process whereby those men who were chosen as mates tended to be motivated and have the ability and willingness to acquire resources and share. So
let me ask you about that specifically. This is a question that I tried to address experimentally at one point, but I couldn't get the experiments organized properly to test this specific hypothesis. Do you know of any research pitting female mate choice in relationship to men against men who have resources versus men who show the traits that allow them to acquire resources, pitting those directly against.
It's interesting because you would obviously in some ways think about younger versus older men, younger men with potential, older men with already established resources, and therefore, I mean, this whole conversation just touches on a lot of interesting things. And again, part of what's so challenging about human beings is that each of us, and this is where I mean, we're talking about groups and we're using statistics to try to gain that, but then this sort of, then when we talk about it, and later on in the conversation, they're going to talk about some ideas which don't fit our sense of the ethical landscape or the moral landscape, and should psychologists do these studies to expose things about ourselves. And so there's a lot running in this between males and females. And of course, we don't live our lives as males and females. We live our lives as a particular male or a particular female, and then we go out into the world. And there are so many variables for each of us and so many constraints
against one another.
Yeah, great question. And I'm not aware of any studies that have done that directly.
See, I think that, and this is, I want to talk to you about this in relationship to the dark triad issue, which we'll get into. It seems to me that
they're going to get into it quite a while later.
Women use markers of status partly as indicators of available resources because those are useful, but I don't think women are that uncanny, let's say. It's too simple. I think they use the presence of resources as a proxy for the personality and cognitive traits, let's say, including physical health, that would enable a man, even stripped of his current set of resources, to be highly likely to acquire them in the future.
Now, when I hear him set this thing up, I think immediately of the movie Titanic, because, of course, Rose has an engagement to someone who has inherited wealth and a few character played by Billy Zane, a few emblems of a few reasonable markers of potential, let's say, but then you have Jack. And in many ways, the whole movie, up until, of course, the Titanic hits the iceberg, where you're going to have this grand sorting thing, it's this competition between Jack and, I have to go to IMDb and try and remember what the other dude's name was supposed to be in the movie. Okay, here we go. Cal Hockley. And, of course, Leonardo DiCaprio as Jack. And I think what's interesting, the video I posted today is about movies. What's interesting is that a lot of these psychological questions, which Jordan Peterson just basically put out, we sort of work on these in our literature and in our narratives and in our movies. And at least part of what's behind these movies is we're asking the question. And my guess is that the popularity of Titanic, its target audience and its popularity is mostly among women. And beneath that movie is, in some ways, this question that Jordan is asking. Are you a Cal Hockley kind of guy who has inherited wealth? And so then you've got subtle questions about, well, does inherited wealth, even though they've got access to resources, does that make one a better husband or someone who has the potential for status? Because inherited status likely has with it some liabilities that potential for status does not have. And that's an enormously nuanced question, because let's say if some of the potential for status and success is heritable, then if in fact the resources are inherited, then perhaps also the traits are inherited. But again, Kate Winslet or Rose is going to have to decide between these two men. And in some ways, the movie Titanic is sort of the experiment that Jordan Peterson is asking for. And I think that's really quite cool.
And maybe current resources are a good proxy for that.
Yeah, I think yeah. So one issue is that cash economies are relatively recent in our human history. I think maybe 7 to 10,000 years old or so. And so there,
And this is going to lead to some really interesting stuff. There's so much cool stuff in this talk. I really love this talk.
So we are able to stockpile economic resources in a way that is evolutionarily unprecedented.
Okay, and how are we're stockpiling? A little later, Peterson's going to talk about we're stockpiling status, but we're stockpiling resources in a sense in the upper register. Now haunting this conversation is Jesus and the Sermon on the Mount. So you have Jesus saying, "Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust, and consuming insects." I'm reading out of the LEB, which tries to be sort of technical on some of this. "Destroy, and where thieves break in and steal, but store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where moth nor consuming insect destroy, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also." It's, we're waiting on Jordan Peterson to talk about Exodus, but Esther said, and I think she's right, it'd be really interesting to have Jordan Peterson dive into the Gospels and especially the Sermon on the Mount. Sermon on the Mount is an enormously complex body of work historically. Anyway, it's just interesting how we have, with cash, in a sense, you have the potential of transforming all of this physical stuff into the upper register. And of course, it can go back and forth, up and down, depending on the context. There's that famous scene in Castaway where, Tom Hanks is burning money because what good is money going to do for him on his deserted island?
Due to cash economies. But I think that you're absolutely right that what women tend to look for, and shows up even in my studies as well, is the characteristics that are statistically reliably correlated with resource acquisition, which will be things like intelligence.
I love how you can make this the most unromantic stuff. You just want me for my resource acquisition, which he's actually going to get into later. Male objectification.
Social status, dependability, athletic prowess. Is this guy a good hunter? So you go to a culture like the Ache of Paraguay, and basically what leads to high status in men is hunting skills. That's like the big main effect there. And so I think even things like, that I know you've talked about this and you measure them as some of the big five characteristics, even things like emotional stability and conscientiousness, which we know is linked with hard work and industriousness and achievement in modern work context, likely was true ancestrally as well. So women didn't want a guy who's going to be sitting around in the hammock all day, smoking whatever the local, weed or hallucinogen is. She's going to want a guy who has the motivation to get out there and hunt and bring back the bacon, so to speak.
Yeah, and the hunting thing is really interesting when you think about also how much we've abstracted ourselves out of our basic biological niche in some sense, because hunting and getting to the point and hitting the target and aiming right and being specific with words and all of that kind of goal-oriented action, those are all very tightly related.
Exaptation.
As far as I can tell, psychologically. And then you said something quite interesting earlier as well that we didn't comment on. You talked about men as a breeding experiment run by women. And this ties into another reason why evolutionary psychology is so important, is because we're unbelievably highly sexually selected. And that has to do with women's choosiness. And so maybe we could start our discussion of sexual differences in mating strategy with that. So first of all, what's the evidence that suggests that women are in fact choosier when it comes to sexual partners than men? And how much choosier are they?
Okay, great question. Well, so maybe first we could just define for listeners what sexual selection theory is, because most people, when they think about evolution, they think of survival of the fittest and that sort of nature redding tooth and claw.
Yes, and a kind of a randomness too, which, that's kind of implicit in the natural selection theory, whereas sexual.
Okay, now, if you watch my Sunday school class, I will talk about some of this nature-nurture stuff. So nature is assumed to be this objective order out there. Now, again, when we think about that, we imagine it, but we imagine the third personal through the first personal. We sort of implicitly put an observer on there, and we sort of say the observer is anything and anyone, and well, that's nature out there, and it's grass and trees, and the marriage and family therapist and trauma therapist in my Sunday school class always says, well, I always think of nature nurture. And this gets very much into C.S. Lewis's idea of, human is the trained dog. Natural is the dog without human beings. Human is the trained dog. But now humans are this combination of nature and nurture. There's this dualism that we have tended to deal with, and of course supernaturals, they had a third category. So natural would be, let's say, the wolf. In the reason applied to the wolf would be the trained dog, let's say, the domesticated animal, and the supernatural dog would be the talking dog.
Selection is anything but random.
Yeah, absolutely. So
right away, there's intentionality. There's a degree of forecasting. There's a degree of, and always, what degree of it is there? Well, I just like men who are competent and who display athletic prowess and who display characteristics that hint at fertility, or I just like women with a certain waist to hip ratio and, or they seem to be articulate, which might indicate intelligence, but they're not sitting there thinking, I'm going to pass these on to my children. Someone in Twitter, I was posting some clips from this talk on Twitter, and someone mentioned, he was this person's boss at work is a married lesbian, and they were trying to decide what kind of sperm donor they wanted, and they're going through all kinds of loops to try to act like they weren't going to try to pick the patriarchal champion as the sperm donor for their yet to be produced child.
Natural selection. So if natural selection, this is oversimplified, but is the evolution of adaptations due to their survival advantage, or the survival advantage that accrued to the possessors. So things like fear of snakes.
Now, one of the interesting things about all this talk about survival advantage is that this is also quite first personal. And that doesn't mean that you can't draw statistics from it and say that, well, let's say people living in a particular environment with a lot of poisonous snakes as opposed to people living in another environment without poisonous snakes, that poisonous snakes will take their toll on the environment. It's just that all the way back to Vervaeke stuff, we've got our own salience landscape that's happening that we're trying to pick out the factors. And now consciousness is monofocal, and that tends to reduce the list down to a limited number of factors that we believe are the most important, but we sort of naturally eliminate all sorts of other factors. Let's say lack of oxygen in the atmosphere. Well, we just assumed that. Oh, good, we assumed it. That's fine, but I'm just saying there's a lot of selection that goes into this whole thing from the beginning.
Fear of heights, spiders, darkness, strangers, and so forth, food preferences, things that led to better survival. Sexual selection deals with the evolution of qualities that lead to mating success. And Darwin identified two.
Now, I still haven't played that clip from Peterson and Rogan about success, because that is such a key clip for all of this. Because again, we just throw out this word like success, such as we all know what that means. we got an idea. We got a workable idea. Our use of the word is pretty good, but success means in what time frame? Towards which goal?
Two causal processes by which mating success could occur. One is same-sex competition or intrasexual competition. And the logic there is that whatever, he thought about it in terms of contest competition, where there was a physical battle, like two stags locking horns in combat, with the victor gaining sexual access to the female, loser ambling off with a broken antler, dejected with low self-esteem and probably needing some psychotherapy. But the logic was whatever
this guy's fun
qualities led to success in these same-sex battles, whether it be athleticism, strength, agility, cunning, or whatever, those qualities got passed on in greater numbers due to the sexual access that the victors accrued.
Okay, now so he's just basically laid it out that this is sort of the Darwinian landscape that we're working from, and we're going to apply this to human beings. Now, right away, we're going to have the question of, well, what exactly is a human being? Because then we have all of these, monkey skeletons and things going back, and it's like, well, does that apply to them? Well, how much of this applies to them? Because a little bit later, we're gonna talk quite a bit about the fact that it's not just men bumping chests. That is how men compete for women. Men compete for women in lots and lots and lots and lots of ways, and depending on the society. A little bit later in this conversation, they're going to talk about the fact that we have this enormous proliferation of competence hierarchies that men are using. Men are voting each other up the hierarchy that men are using to compete for attention, to attract women. And so that's going to be different than, let's say, maybe perhaps Aboriginals in Australia or other places. And they also are going to have, multiple competence hierarchies to use to demonstrate. But in our culture, the number of dominance hierarchies, we're supposed to not say that word. The number of competence hierarchies are just going to explode. And, well, what does that mean to this whole conversation?
Qualities associated with losing basically bit the evolutionary dust. The second component, so that's intrasexual competition, which actually the logic is more general than Darwin envisioned. So like in our...
And when we get to success, we're going to have to ask, well, we're all looking, let's say, at Western civilization as successful. What if our success in this time frame with this culture sets up a society in which we are no longer reproducing? Should we consider this society a success? Maybe the success in our society is a terminal condition. This stuff gets complicated.
Our species, as we were alluding to, we often compete for position and status hierarchies. And so we can engage in intrasexual competition without engaging in this physical battle or contest competition, although I think that the contest competition was also part of human evolutionary history with males. The other component process is basically what Darwin called female choice. And the logic there is that whatever qualities, if there's some consensus about the qualities that are desired, that men possessing the desired qualities have a mating advantage.
Men possessing the qualities, but also there's a communal aspect to the quality. Nothing's more attractive to a woman than a man who's already taken by a woman. And sometimes the other way around, but women get together, and together they begin to agree on what qualities are desirable. It's not that they're all just sitting here programmed, but there's also sort of this horizontal layer culturally that is happening at the same time. And right now, all the women want bald men with big beards. How about that?
They get preferentially chosen. Those lacking the desired qualities basically become incels or involuntarily celibate. They get shunned, banned.
All you men with hair.
or ignored. Now, the twist on that, and so I think sexual selection is by far a more interesting process, and definitely has occurred with respect to humans. But the twist there is that we have mutual mate choice, at least when it comes to long-term mating, especially when it comes to long-term mating.
So in other words, it's not just mate choice now, but it continues, and those factors change, and so now you've got both sides, and yeah, it's just manifestly complex.
And that gets to the issue of Trevor's theory of parental investment, where he asked the question, well, which sex does the choosing, which sex does the competing? And his answer was the sex that invests more in offspring tends to be choosier. Sex that invests less tends to be more competitive for access to those desirable members of the opposite sex. But in long-term mating, now we know from our reproductive biology that women have that 9-month pregnancy, which is obligatory. So women can't say, look, I'm really busy with.
Now, part of this is also interesting because we sort of want to say there are things beneath our conscious level and things above the conscious level. So we sort of imagine that there's nature, which is, let's say, genetics, and that's fixed, that's objective, that's static, that's biological, that's material. And then there's nurture, which is reason. And again, if you look at C.S. Lewis's Miracles, reason is almost this micro miracle that sort of comes to us, that interrupts the whole show. But when we think about how people function, there's this gray in between where they're selecting things. Well, we might call these matters of taste, where it's not exactly just set in there. I better move this a little bit here. It's not exactly sort of set in there, but it's also sort of chosen, and there tends to, I think, probably be something of a cycle that goes back and forth in this, and it's sort of a boundary water area there. It's sort of an estuary area where you've got a mixing of these, but it's not fully conscious. And some theory, maybe they listen to some Brett Weinstein or something and say, oh, I know why I like tall men, because tall men have superior immune systems or something like that, so it's not clear cut. It's not clear cut like this. I hate it when I don't turn on record. So we tend to think of sort of two distinct realms, sort of nature, which is set and fixed and concrete and objective and material, and nurture, which is intentional, purposive, reasonable, conscious, this type of thing. But the reality is quite a bit more nuanced, and we might call it taste, where we sort of go in and out of rationality, and it's of course all mixed in together, how these things are processed within us.
Want to put in 3 months, it's just part of our reproductive biology to produce one child, and men can produce that same child through one act of sex. And so women are, at least when it comes to sex, the choosier sex, the higher investing sex, in part because the costs of making a bad mating decision are much more severe for women than for men. Man and woman hook up, have sex for one night, in the morning they both realize, oh, this is a mistake, I shouldn't have done that. Well, if the woman gets pregnant, then she might be pregnant with a guy who is not going to invest in her offspring. A guy perhaps is someone that...
Now it's very interesting how the example from Twitter of the lesbian boss, where she doesn't want investment from the man. And again, this is where our culture is so, technology is so disruptive. I want your seed. I don't want you. Oh. Now, again, whether the child that this test tube produces will feel that way, test tube um, or the turkey baster, whether the child feels that way, well, there's another question.
Has poor genetic material. It does not have a robust immune system, etc. So anyway, so that's a long-winded answer to your question about sexual selection.
Go ahead, please. Go ahead.
I was just going to say that you asked about the evidence for females being choosier, and they are choosier primarily in the context of casual sex or short-term sex. So that's where you find the big sex differences. And so one of the classic, and there's a ton of evidence for this. This is a sex.
I love this part of the conversation because it's like, and anybody who's gone to high school or college knows this. And now studies confirm what we all know here.
Difference that I capture in the book under the category of desire for sexual variety. So men have a much greater desire for, meaning a variety of sex partners than women do. And so the choosiness comes in on, I'll just give you one experiment. This is a classic study done by Elaine Hatfield and Russell Clark, where they had male and female Confederates, which for listeners are members of the experimental team. It doesn't mean people from the South United States.
They're people running around college campuses with Confederate flags and muskets asking questions.
But they had male and female Confederates simply walk up to members of the opposite sex on a college campus and say, "Hi, I've been noticing you around campus lately."
Now, this is where psychology it's really very interesting, because of course, how the woman looks doesn't matter. How the man looks doesn't matter. Well, yeah, it does. Can you factor all those variables into your equation? I mean, if the hottest girl on campus is asking questions, and then you have, I mean, of course you can't. Let's rank order the Confederates to see how their responses differ, and of course randomly choose. The whole thing is just fascinating.
I find you very attractive. Would you, and they asked them one of three questions. Would you go on a date with me tonight? Would you come back to my apartment with me? Would you have sex with me? And it was a between groups design. So they simply recorded the percentage of individuals who agreed to these three different requests. And of the women, about half, about a little over 50% agreed to go out on a date with the guy. 6% agreed to go back to his apartment. 0% agreed to have sex with him. Most women need a little more information about the guy before.
I'll tell a story. So when I was going to Calvin, we had 6 of us guys living in an apartment on campus, and that's kind of how it was working then. And the apartment was in the building Gamma, and it was apartment number 8. And so we decided one day to have the Great Gamma 8 group date. And we all see one of the guys didn't participate because he had a steady girlfriend, but the rest of the 5 of us were unattached. And so part of the rules of the game were we had to you couldn't pick your own date. You had to trust the other guys you're living with to pick your date for you. And we all worked really hard to try to get dates that everyone would really be happy with, because so then the 10 of us would all go out and do something together, and of course 10 guys living in an apartment, and we're all living together, and we're having fun, and it's crazy. We had these huge wrestling matches. We're in a second floor apartment. The guys downstairs hated us because we'd move all the furniture out of the middle of the room, and we were one of the guys had a background in wrestling with my roommate Calvin. It wasn't exactly fair, but we were all at this point, big guys or big Dutchmen, and they're just wrestling like crazy in the middle of the room. Maybe that's because we couldn't get any women to wrestle with. So we had the great Gamma 8 group date, and we decided that, well, we were going to go. There was in Grand Rapids at that time, there was a hot tub place called Hubba Tubba, where you could basically rent a hot tub for a few hours. And we decided we're going to all go to the Hubba Tubba with the great Gamma 8 group date. And we eventually had to change the plan because too many of the women were like, they were a little interested. But then when they heard about the hot tub, it's like, nope. It's like, nope, not going to the hot tub. So then we decided we'd just walk around Monroe Plaza. And we all did, in fact, get a date. And I got lovely, attractive dates. I'm trying to think if any of them finally worked out. Boy, it's a complex business. But this story is just hilarious because everybody knows the answer to this.
Where they're willing to have sex. Of the men approach, also about 50 by the female confederate, about 50% agreed to go out on the date.
So both the men and women are saying they're willing, give it a chance to have a date. But it's so funny, like 50%, 6%, 0%. Now the men,
69% agreed to go back to her apartment. And
so yeah, we could skip the date. Let's just go to your apartment. 69%.
75% agreed to have sex with her.
So don't need a date. Don't even need to go to the apartment. It's just 75% versus 0%. Yeah, I think men and women are just the same. Now, I am not going to play this because often if I play this, the YouTube won't let it through. But I'm just going to show you where to find this video, and I'll put it below, and definitely watch it. Because the question is, asked 100 married men what they would be willing to say, what they would be willing to say or do to get sex. And what was so hilarious was that, let me see if I can just pop to the questions here. So men were willing to pay, men were willing to beg, men were willing to lie, men were willing to kill, men were willing to die for sex. 100 married men. They asked the women, clean, bat. No, men weren't willing to clean for sex. Cook, bat. Men weren't willing to cook for sex. And Steve Harvey just has a field day with it. Again, I'm not going to play the video, but by all means, watch it. I don't know how Jordan can keep a straight face during this.
And so if you talk about choosiness, are you willing to have sex with a total stranger who you've met for 30 seconds? Women unwilling to, and in general, men very willing to. And this is a study that's been replicated now in several European studies. Very difficult to do this, as you might imagine, to get this by the IRBs or ethics committees in the United States anyway. I assume it's similar in Canada.
Or worse.
This is incredible.
Or worse. So, but yeah, the kinds of studies we really want to do are more difficult to do nowadays. But it's been replicated in several Western European countries, and you can get women off of the 0%. You can get a few percent of the women saying yes if the guy's really, really charming. If he's Brad Pitt or.
If Tom Brady is asking the questions, and there's a great Saturday Night Live skit about sexual harassment about that too. It's just hysterical.
Or I don't know what the modern equivalent is, Ryan Gosling, or one of the, or perhaps a famous rock star. But that's one illustration of the answer to your question about, well, what is the evidence for female choosiness? Now, the interesting thing, I'll give you one more. So there are studies that ask, what is the minimum percentile of intelligence that you would accept in a potential partner. So
men are dogs. We are just dogs.
And we explain percentiles to people so they understand 99th percentile, first percentile, 50th, and so forth. And basically for things like a marriage partner, men and women are roughly equal. They both are very exact. And they say what they want, like say 65th, 70th percentile in
we want above average
intelligence. Where the sex difference comes up is just a sex partner, a pure sex partner with no investment. Women still maintain, they still want, let's say, 60th or 60 plus percentile.
Need a little pillow talk, need some enlightening conversation over dinner. Men?
In intelligence, whereas men drop, to embarrassing levels. That doesn't really, it becomes irrelevant. The 35th, 40th percentile men go, if she can mumble a little bit, that's fine, or even not. So
I don't know. I laughed my head off when I watched this the first time. It's so true.
That's another indication of female choosiness, that is, they maintain greater choosiness when it comes to short-term sex, and are simply less comfortable with having sex with total strangers or casual sex. And I'll give you one more now that I'm rambling on, and then I'll get to some other.
No, please go. This guy's good. I like this guy.
Interesting issues is this is an item on the sociosexuality inventory that colleagues Steve Gangestad and Jeff Simpson developed a long time ago. But one of the items that's an attitude item, and it says sex without love is okay. Do you agree with that or disagree with that? And there you get a large...
And again, more survey questions that are absolutely obvious.
Sex difference. So in the 7-point scale where 4 is the midpoint, men average about 5.5. So they say, yeah, sex without love, yeah, that's okay. Women are about 3.5. Okay, they're below that midpoint. It's another indication.
And if you watch The Bachelor, last week's show, I was tempted to make a whole video on this. So our boy Clayton is out there looking for love, and the way Bachelor goes, of course, you get trimmed down, and just a few women. So he's down to 3, and when you get down to 3, then you get this whole thing of fantasy suites. ABC is always real coy about, gosh, what are these couples doing at night all by themselves with, the cameras are trying to wink, wink. Here's what they're doing. Well, Clayton takes Rachel into the fantasy suite. Clayton takes, what was her name? Gabby into the fantasy. And Gabby's been very outspoken about the fact that she thinks she wants men to have gotten around so that they can choose her after they've tasted all the other wild flowers. And our boy Clayton likes to taste. So, which is evident because I always, it's like, oh, we don't need to see the dude kissing. We really don't need to watch this. So then there's Susie. And these shows are just there to torture these poor people. I mean, it's like, would you be willing to be tortured for fame and fortune? Yes, please. We're here for love. You're there for torture. You're there for money. And you're hoping to get love out of it too. But you're better off finding a mate on Survivor than The Bachelor or Bachelorette. Anyway, so then all along that whole week, Susie's just sitting there and thinking, well, if Clayton is really into me as he says he's into me, but of course he's with all these girls and you're watching, and the Bachelorette goes through this whole business about, will they say love or not? Will they say love or not? And it sort of swings back over time. And right now Clayton's in he's willing to use the love word when he's talking to these girls, and then they're all thinking, it's all about me. It's all about Rachel and Susie and Gabby. It's all about the 3 of you. Because he's a male, a young, healthy male. And so Susie all week is just wringing her hands at Clayton. Well, Clayton, surely if Clayton thinks about me the way I want him to think about me, he won't have sex with these other girls. I was just watching this thinking, oh boy. She doesn't tell him this. This is where if you sort of have a societal standard, maybe it'll go a little easier, maybe. But of course, then they have the whole date for the afternoon and evening, and then he can decide whether to give her the card for the fantasy suite. And she brings it up, and she says, "Because I don't know how you feel about me, blah 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 blah. Well, I'm falling in love with you. You were the first one that I had feelings for," and she even gets it out of him that she's kind of top of the hierarchy of the three, and which, of course, I don't know how the other two are going to think about it when they go back and watch this. So, and then it comes out, yeah, I did have sex with Gabby and Rachel. And so then Susie, I thought to her credit, draws a line and says, well, then I'm out. But she's not quite ready to totally walk out. So she walks out the door. Then Clayton throws a fit. I knew this would happen. It's like, you're talking to the producers. You've sold yourself for reality TV, buddy. Enjoy the money and the status and the fame. It comes at a cost. And then Susie's kind of not ready to totally draw the line, but at this point he's furious, and so now by the time you watch this, it might be out yet. So don't put any spoilers in the comment section. We watch these things as a group, and we have fun with them. So anyway, yeah, these differences matter. They matter a lot, and they are the source of a lot of consternation.
Of this sex difference in choosiness.
Do you know if that's modulated by Big Five trait agreeableness?
Oh, that's a great question. I haven't seen any studies that link that.
Okay.
Big Five to that item or the sociosexuality inventory in general.
Yeah, well, you'd wonder why, if compassion and empathy might be one of the things driving that, and the value that's placed on that as a consequence of being high or low in agreeableness. And that would fit in to some degree with the dark triad work, that because the primary difference there is, we'll talk about the dark triad in a minute, is that the dark triad types are low in agreeableness centrally. It's not the only thing, but that's central.
Yes.
So, and that's where there's a big sex difference. And so I want to ask you a terminological question.
Sure.
Okay.
Sure.
So
I'm sorry.
Please,
sorry to interrupt, but I just thought we should say a few more words about your question about patriarchy.
Yes.
Because I thought that was a really interesting question, and there's some interesting complexities associated with that. And so what I started with is that you have to break it down analytically into precisely what causal process you're invoking. And usually when people invoke it, it's like this mysterious causal force in the ether that somehow comes down and infects people's minds.
And this is where I want to get into Truman's book a little bit, and into Charles Taylor and a bunch of the things that Truman gets into.
And they don't get into the question of, what are the causal origins of what you're calling patriarchy? And to get to that, you have to get to things like female mate preferences and the coevolution of those mate preferences with male mating strategies. And
that's key. It's these both things are sort of coming together all along.
The part of male mating strategies is to prioritize resource acquisition and clawing their way up the status hierarchy, and selling their grandmother to get ahead. And
Nathan made the comment that, Net Rationality Rules is going to have a field day with this, but boy, I'll tell you, a lot of men think that all of the men adopting woke posturing, woke language, a lot of this, it's just a mating strategy. It's just a way to attract women. Women are all together. Oh yeah, this is what we believe. That's what you believe. That's what I believe. Oh, the patriarchy's horrible. Oh, the patriarchy's horrible. I'm against the patriarchy. Do you like me now? I mean, this is how we are. We're funny, silly creatures.
And studies of this gets to another sex difference, that women tend to allocate their time, energy, and investment across a wider array of, what we call adaptive problems. So, women more than men invest in
that's an interesting thing.
Kin, even if they're married, they invest more in their in-laws, in their friendships, et cetera. And men, on average, tend to be more monomaniacal about getting ahead.
And it's very interesting that Peterson makes the point again and again and again and again that women are dominating the field of psychology. But here's a guy who's at the top of the field. Why is he at the top of the field? Men are more monomaniacal. Men are like they're gonna climb to the top of this status hierarchy.
So you could say the most effective long-term strategy for smashing the patriarchy is for women to select low-ranking mates to sleep with.
And I think that I took that clip out, and I think he's right. So you're saying there's a chance, but what's funny is that this gets into some of my thinking about the same-sex marriage problem or conversation, because these things matter intergenerationally, and a lot of our thinking at some point we're going to have to talk about morality tends to be upper register. Okay, right, wrong, there it is, right, wrong. And I watched Carefree Wanderer, that dude, and somebody sent me his video and I was tempted to make some commentary about that, but you say, oh, it's all this black and white morality thinking. We shouldn't do that. It's like, wait, what? We shouldn't. It's like, if you're using English, how else am I going to make the sentence? I mean, there's so many of these little traps. So Peterson here, he just sort of nails it. Well, okay, so pick low status guys. Okay, do it for 300 years. 300 years in the totality of let's say even human civilization. Let's mark it at say 10,000 years to be rather brief. Let's say. So why don't you marry low status guys for 1,000 years? Well, who's you? You begin to be able to keep this up? Well, what about the free riders? It's like, yeah, we're gonna have to look for husbands among the dim, among the unfaithful, among the lazy. Let's just keep doing that. And some women are going to be like, and among the unattractive. Some women are going to be like, well, I'm going to sneak over to the gym and find me a hot one. Yep. Traitors to the cause.
Yes. So if you
I should get in lots of trouble for that.
well, if women changed their mate preferences so that they didn't care about status and resources and those qualities, and you iterated that over enough generations, yeah, it would.
How many generations would you need? Would 1,000 years do it? Just incredible.
It would ultimately change male behavior.
So, okay,
it's changing it now. But it's so funny because I watch these guys do it, and it's like they're competitive to be against competition. Oh, okay.
I have a terminological issue that was raised to me by one of my graduate students, a very, very intelligent man and very careful thinker. I had faster graduate students, but I don't think I had any who would worry a problem absolutely to death as much as he would. He always he was an engineer and is an engineer, and he would really get to the bottom of things like you did with the patriarchy, at least to some degree. He told me, once I started speaking more public, he said, stop using the term dominance hierarchy or status hierarchy. there's a political supposition nested inside there that's not helpful. How about competence hierarchy? And I thought, oh, that's real interesting. Okay, so that's one issue. Now, I have another question that's teamed with that I want to run by you with regards to sexual selection. So we could say that it's the actions of female selection that have shaped men to a large degree because of the choosiness of women. But I want to run a...
We're not only part of their breeding program, they raise us. It's like they house us for the first 9 months since conception, and then they raise us for the first 4 or 5 years. It's like, yeah, women... We're just victims. Every man around here has been pretty much you picked the sperm, you had us in your womb, you taught us right from wrong from a very early age. I think you got a pretty good I think you got a fair amount of say in the male population in the world.
Counterposition by you. So imagine a football team in a small American town. It's kind of an archetypal issue. And the whole town is celebrating the football team, and the football team is ranked in terms of competence. And the football team wins the game, and all the guys lift the quarterback up on their shoulders because he was the hero of the game, and they march him out of the stadium. And so he sleeps with the cheerleaders. And I would say he was elected by the men to sleep with them. Because if it's not competition, I think the idea that it's competition exactly it's not exactly right, and terminology really matters. It's like, because men will organize themselves into groups, and those who become elevated in status don't do it by dominating. My students said, well, you don't get people to wear a choke collar and a chain. It's not dominance. And so,
well, that's, I'm so glad that you asked that, because we just did the whole subject of status hierarchies and dominance hierarchies is something that we are studying now in my lab. And we just published a paper that confirms precisely the point that you're making, where we looked at basically whether status is determined by dominance, which in the literature is sometimes defined as cost infliction. So you have the ability and willingness to inflict costs and, beat up, your rivals, or confer benefits, which gets to your point about competence. And what we found is that in our study, this is with Patrick Durkee, a current graduate student of mine who actually just passed his dissertation defense yesterday. So congratulations, shout out to Patrick, is that what we found is that...
Way to go, Patrick.
It is conferring benefits, that is the ability and willingness to confer benefits that led to high status.
Okay, so I'm going to stop just for one sec, because I want to add something with regard to our discussion of the patriarchy. Because one of the unspoken suppositions of the idea of the patriarchy is that part of the reason that it's bad is because it's dominance and oppression that leads to the formation of these hierarchies. And that's a central claim, but this gets to a real alternative to that, and so what do you mean by benefit exactly in that context?
So well, these are conferring benefits on either individuals or the group that you're part of. And so the example that you used of the quarterback who, scored the winning touchdown or led the team to victory, he's conferring a large benefit on the coalition of which he's a part. And we evolved as coalitional species, but the benefits are many in number. I mean, they could be, meat from the hunt, providing not just to your family, but also to the group. In small group living, they often shared the spoils of the hunt, providing physical protection. So having the ability, bravery. So the physical ability, the athleticism.
In other words, he's not just ruling out of fear. He's providing benefits.
But also the courage to offer protection for a potential mate or for members of your coalition. So there are many, many different types of benefits.
I read recently that among smaller groups that are dependent on hunting, that in the male groups, where hunting takes place. One of the most common characteristics of the hunters with more prowess is they're willing to be self-sacrificing in their food choice after they kill something. And so the men have status conferred on them. Well, they were successful hunters, but if they can be successful hunters and give someone else who was there a bigger share than they get, even though they did the hunting, that's a way of moving up in status. And that
See, Jesus is wired in from the start. The God of redemption is the God of creation. That's why you don't beat the Creator. He's got all the back doors.
kind of behavior is very common in men's groups in small societies around the world.
Yes.
The opposite of narcissism. Interestingly enough.
Yeah. No, that's right. And that's why in our study we had 240 things that could either increase or decrease your status. And one of them was precisely that generosity with resources. So you can have all the resources in the world, but if you're stingy and don't share them with your group, then you're not going to be rising in status. But I just add one interesting curlicue to your point about this, and that's the Ache that I mentioned earlier. Kim Hill is the bioanthropologist who's studied the Ache in the greatest detail. He's lived with them on and off for 25 years or so. And what he so in the Ache hunting skill, they also share their resources. So the large game animal goes to a central distributor. Okay, but, and here's the interesting curlicue, sometimes the head hunter will slice off a prime piece of meat and have a friend or emissary give it to his affair partner before.
Tony Soprano keeping the Goomba over there on the boat.
Returning to the home base.
What was the boat's name? Risky Business, something like that?
And so good hunters tend to have more sex partners in the Ache, and I suspect in many hunter-gatherer groups.
Right, and that would be a specific exception that would be of sexual benefit to that hunter outside the general sexual benefit that generosity would give him as a consequence of being of high status among
those who have, more will be given.
Among his cohort.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that's kind of building on your point about this issue of generosity with resources is that people form groups. So, and often there's competition between groups for having members that are, in this case, good hunters or who contribute, above and beyond to the group welfare. And so if a hunter feels like if someone is a top hunter.
So in other words, of course, the competition is nested.
And he feels like he's not sufficiently appreciated by the group, he can go to another group or form another group. And that's one of the interesting things about, this gets into human history is, once group, there's the fissioning of groups. Once they get to a certain point, they often say, look, I'm not sufficiently appreciated in this group. I'm going to take my allies and form my own group.
And there's all this. Oh, why would Christian evangelicals support Donald Trump? Donald Trump did things for the group. Now you might want to say, well, but there's other things. People are willing to overlook a whole lot of things if they're willing to get what they want. Now, obviously, in terms of the groups, there's a real conversation and competition with respect to which characteristics go along with it. But these conversations are always being had at all sorts of different levels.
So I was also thinking about this in terms of, let's say, reciprocity. So imagine that we're in a small hunting group. We don't have refrigeration, so we're not going to be able to store meat with any great degree of reliability. So you might say, well, what's the best way to store meat? And I would say you should store meat in your status among the hunting group.
Wow. This is... Oh, come up. Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and consuming insects destroy and where thieves break in and steal, but store up for yourselves treasures in heaven. basically, and Jesus has other sayings that talk about this, you store up your reputation with God. Well, reputation, well, someone might try to undermine it, attack it, gossip. I mean, it's a genius way of changing registers. You take the meat from down here and you turn it into reputation up there.
Right. So if you're generous and you share, and then that invokes reciprocity from other hunters in your group who also have prowess, then you've stored future meat in the potential for them to generate resources in the future. And that's reciprocity dependent. And so that's also a way that kind of long-term honesty could also be selected for in these so-called status hierarchies. Competence hierarchies is better. And so my student, he said there's a subterranean Marxism in the terminology. If it's status hierarchy, dominance hierarchy, implies that it's oppression that's building the hierarchies. And that's something really worthy of note, that objection.
Yeah. So well, let me come back to that in just one second. But I think it actually was. I just recently saw your interview with Steve Pinker and Jonathan Haidt, and Steve Pinker is, I think a wonderful thinker. And the way he phrased it is that hunters store meat, not in the refrigerator, but they store meat in the bodies of other people. So
now, even with what had just happened right there, I mean, he remembered that quote well, and he could have easily simply given that quote as of his own, sort of plagiarized it in person. And it would probably be almost zero social cost to having done that. But no, he attributed it to Steven Pinker. And, well, why? Well, he's operating in this nested community, and he's showing himself to be a good faith actor, and that gets him voted up the hierarchy by, at least especially for Steven Pinker fans.
It's kind of an interesting way to think about that, of how we engage in that reciprocity. With respect to the oppression issue, here's what I would add to this, is that one of the implicit assumptions of people who invoke patriarchy as an explanation is that they assume that men are somehow united in their interests as a group in oppressing women as a group. Okay, and from an evolutionary perspective, that can't occur, because men are primarily in competition with other men, not with other women. And also each individual has alliances with some members of our own sex, some rivalries with members of our own.
Brett Weinstein made this point a number of years ago, and I thought it was a good point. He said this is part of the way in which competition between sexes is different from competition between races. And I thought that was a good point.
Sex, but also alliances with some members of the opposite sex. So every man has, for example, a mother, sometimes a daughter, a sister, an aunt, a niece. And similarly, every woman has a brother, a father, et cetera. And so the notion that men are somehow united as a group with a goal of oppressing women as a group, it just can't occur from an evolutionary perspective. And so, and this is why I think an evolutionary perspective lends some conceptual clarity to some of these vaguer notions that people don't tend to think about when they invoke terms like patriarchy. So, but I agree with you on the point of oppression, that when we talk about status hierarchies, we don't mean oppression. What we did is, what Patrick Durkee and I did in our studies, basically, is we pitted the dominance explanation, or some people have invoked it, dual pathways. Some people say there's two ways to get ahead. You can inflict costs, or you can confer benefits. And we tested that. And then what's called a competence model. So there is a theory of status that's based in competence, but it's basically benefit conferral. And we found evidence in favor of the competence model and the benefit conferral model, but almost no evidence for the cost inflicting model. Indeed, what we found is that although sometimes people have the ability and willingness to inflict cost, you have to be more differentiated even about that. So, for example, we've been talking about coalitions to some degree, and people punish free riders, for example, or cheaters within coalitions.
Yeah. They punish them. So that's an infliction of cost.
Yeah, it's an infliction of cost, but it's for the larger group, for the larger coalition.
And the group wants the free riders punished. So when you look at, for example, I talk a lot when I'm preaching about the Gospels about the Judean culture war in the first century. They want the other group punished. You can see that in our present culture war. They want the other group punished. So we're all against suffering. Suffering is bad. Accept the suffering of my enemy. That's good suffering.
And so that's why this notion that you could, or even like if you take extreme cases, like as I'm sure you're familiar with, like in some nations, some people kill to get to the top of the hierarchy. So Big Daddy Amin in, I can't remember which country it was, maybe Zimbabwe. Or
he's got Papa Doc and Baby Doc mixed up with Idi Amin. Idi Amin in Uganda, Papa Doc and Baby Doc in Haiti.
Zaire, I can't remember. Basically was a thug who killed his way to the top, but you can't get to the top through this cost infliction strategy unless you're also conferring benefits. And so even though he was a thug and continued his kind of reign of terror, he had a large coalition of under him that all the benefits went to.
That was Idi Amin, Uganda? Uganda?
Yeah. Yes, Uganda.
Yeah,
Thank you.
yeah.
Yes, Idi Amin.
Okay,
Yeah.
so hey, this experiment. So here's another thing that could be pitted in that competition. So imagine you had men who could confer benefit and who were incapable of inflicting cost, and men who could confer benefit but were capable of inflicting cost. I think you'd see winners on that side because of that free rider problem. And that ties into what we'll discuss in relationship to the dark triad, because there's some mystery about why women seem to be attracted to these so-called dark triad traits. And I would say that they're using them as insufficient markers for the ability to or the acquisition of status. And a
little bit later, when they actually get into the dark triad, one of the points that Buss will make is that it tends to be younger women that earlier in life they fall for members of this dark triad. Later in life, after they've been burned, they gain in wisdom. But this then gets into the necessity of, I always say that a healthy culture is one that confers wisdom upon the people who have not had sufficient time in their individual lives to accumulate that wisdom. In other words, a healthy culture passes down wisdom to subsequent generations, saving them the time that they need to sort of get up to speed, and therefore setting them up in a successive way. And if you map this over an entire civilization, let's say, you will outcompete other civilizations by virtue of the wisdom that you are giving to successive generations. And I think when we look at what we have done in this culture, that is where we're failing, because what has happened in previous years is that younger generations have been cut off from older generations. Now, it's a very complex thing, from wisdom, and therefore now they are making the mistakes younger in life, and there's going to be a civilizational cost to that. But this was the part of the conversation that I thought was excellent. The rest of it was good too. Wasn't quite as good as what I thought this earlier section was. So I think I'm going to save the Truman book for another video, because I sort of want to use the audio book. And in the past, I've had a little difficulty with Google trying to convince them that use of the audio book in a similar way that I use videos here is fair use. So I'll leave it at this. So let me know what you think.